All right, thank you very much. So I should preface this with apologies. The paper's changed a lot as I've been writing it. So I'm going to end up focusing mainly on one particular set of khipus from the Andes, and I'll bring in the comparative stuff at the end because I think that's something we will work on in the future. So with khipus, so as you know, the khipus are probably best known as the medium by which the Inca Empire recorded information. So Spanish chroniclers say that khipus recorded narratives, histories, and biographies, as well as keeping administrative accounts. Khipus have continued in the Andes as probably a fairly continuous tradition, albeit one that hasn't stayed static. So khipus are broadly categorized into what are called ancient and ethnographic khipus. So ancient ones are Inca khipus and earlier archaeological khipus, and ethnographic ones are what might be called like modern khipus, i.e. they're khipus that come from ethnographic settings. Generally, the khipus that the collector has been able to ask the person who made them what they mean. I'm working mainly on ethnographic ones. So this got a set of six technically, ethnographic khipus created in the Yumani Hacienda on the island of the Sun, or the Isla del Sol, in Lake Titicaca, on the Bolivian side of Lake Titicaca. So I've got to put a map up, but it's on the border between Peru and Bolivia, so the lake is split into two. And this island is just past the border onto the Bolivian side. And this was created between 1948 and 1949. So these are currently in the Natural History Museum at the Smithsonian Institute in BC. They are collected there because a Jesuit priest, Antonio Sempere, donated them to the museum in 1955. So these khipus have a relatively simple structure. So if you've seen Inca khipus, oftentimes they have this sort of horizontal cord with a lot of cords hanging down off it. These are fairly typical of ethnographic khipu style, so it tends to be a single cord or a single cord that's then doubled and knotted at the top. So you can see, for instance, this is the single cord, this is the single cord. This is a very classic example of one cord that's doubled, and then you can see the knots. So Sempere included two accompanying notes that explain the broad structure. So this one he calls a triple khipu. So you can see the Spanish in the lower left. The white potato in the middle is called tunta, which is the ordinary type of potato, which they freeze, leaving it in water for a week or more out in the open. So you can see that this khipu contains 3 counts, one for each type of crop that is tied into the cord. So in addition to the white freeze-dried potato in the middle, there is a piece of black freeze-dried potato on one end, and then at the top, and then probably an unknown crop, probably some kind of ochre, unclear, that has come loose from the other end. So when I was taking these photos, I just placed it next to where the gap is. So Sempere's second note referred to the remaining 4 khipus. So for instance, this one. So the big knots are worth 10, the smaller ones are worth 1. When there are 2 threads, the longer one signifies what is produced, the shorter one the amount sold. Generally, they tie the related product at the end, and sometimes they put 2 crops on the same cord, but it is as if they were separate accounts. So you have a few examples of these. And then I'm just going to go back. And then finally, there is this ear tally, which, according to Sempere's notes, was a tally of the numbers of, I think, llamas, if I recall correctly, given as delivered to the owner, the lady of the hacienda. I'll leave it on this one because I think this one's the prettiest. So until relatively recently, khipus, as you probably know, were assumed to be purely mnemonic devices, rather than as systematic forms for recording complex information. In large part, this is due to the sort of legacy of European Enlightenment thought, which consistently denigrated any non-alphabetic manifestation of writing, leading to a corresponding devaluation of the textual traditions of the Americas, Africa, and Asia. So this has left its impact on khipu scholarship, but increasingly, khipu scholarship has realized that khipus convey meaning also through haptic or tactile signifiers. So, for instance, Sabina Hyland, working on Koyata epistolary khipus, has talked about how villagers insisted on handling the khipus without gloves in order to feel the fiber differences, because you can have information encoded in the feel of different fibers, even when they're the same color. So this is also, this importance given to tactile or haptic knowledge is also due to the importance in Andean epistemology of the intersection of different kinds of knowledge. So auditory, visual, and tactile for establishing or conveying authority. So Zoila Mendoza has argued that what she calls the Andean sensory model, the unity of hearing, sight, and bodily movement or touch, is a keystone of Andean forms of knowledge and memory. So this combination of three supposedly separate senses, right, sound, sight, and touch, is essential for meaning and authenticity in the Peruvian Andes. So she writes that for the case of the Andes, the intrinsic relationship that exists among the kinesthetic, visual, and auditory experiences goes beyond the ritual context and is central to knowledge and memory. So this has been this has had its impact on khipu studies in that the quote-unquote classic understandings of definitions, classic understandings and definitions of writing have tended to be solely visual. So the tactile disappears, like I think we've talked about last week as well, which how much, the way we type, for instance, what you produce has very little to do with how you feel if the writing is the same. But without it, the issue is that without the sort of tactile sense, khipus no longer make as much sense. And you can see this underlying epistemological assumption that khipus should be read visually. In the previous dismissal of khipus as a form of writing, and it's had its impact on previous older khipu scholarship, which has tended to find it easiest to analyze khipus as if they were 2D objects, i.e. via drawings or diagrams. And so this has also meant that a fair amount of foundational khipu scholarship during the 20th century had tended to ignore that aspect of khipu semiotics. And then so obviously you build on that scholarship and it gets a bit worse. So for instance, the open khipu repository, for most of those khipus, we don't know what material they're made out of. It's not recorded. People don't know. You also it's also, to be fair, practically difficult because then you have to go in the lifeways of the Andes. So the Andes has historically been, and in many parts still is, a highly agripastoral society with these kind of basic textile skills, combing, spinning, weaving, are really, really common and foundational sort of life skills you have as a child. So when I was doing my doctoral fieldwork in the Andes, I was asking local people to teach me how to spin and how to process wool. And it turned out, and I was in a town, so in an urban environment, but it turned out that pretty much everyone knew, because this was in a community where the vast majority of people were at most one generation moved from farming. And the older people had been farmers and herders in their youth before moving into town, even though they no longer did it. Two, they were very confused, especially the older people were very confused by my desire to learn something which they had regarded as a huge drag. So one person, after struggling, like watching me struggle and try to learn how to spin, said to me very carefully, you know you can buy clothes now. Like she was like, why would you do this if you don't have to? But that's the basic level of knowledge, like to the point where it's not a privilege, just everyone knows, but it's really boring. So if you take that sort of into account, so it blends into the background, then of course it's not something you tend to articulate. Like, why would you even spin if you don't have to? Anyway, but what I want to bring to the fore now, particularly though, is discussing how these khipus might have been talking about how these khipus might have been positioned epistemologically, is the intersection of touch with sight and with sound. In that, I think we can convincingly argue that what we see in these Isla khipus and Island of the Sun khipus is that they continue to work in a tradition where authority is conveyed through, as Mendoza has argued, an intersection of the tactile, the auditory, and the visual. So on the tactile front, at least a few of the khipus out of this set, for instance, are made out of probably what I would guess to be vicuña fiber, or possibly alpaca, which I know because I sneakily took off my gloves and touched them a bit when the curator wasn't looking. But because I remember this, because I remember the shock of touching it because it was so soft in a way that is not sort of standard in what you would feel nowadays. So I think it was probably vicuña. It was softer than what I've touched like alpaca. And these fibers are significant in their context. Vicuña is relatively rare. It's an animal that really lives only at high altitude. It's hard to sort of have as a herd animal. On the visual front, you can see here, and the Sempere says, right, the items are tied directly into the cords themselves. So the ear tally, for instance, is a pretty visual, iconic representation of what is happening and what it's counting. So you can see it, they've clipped the tips of the ears of probably the lambs, and then strung them onto this string. And then auditory. So probably these were given as oral records to the hacienda owner, probably in Aymar, perhaps in Quechua, perhaps in Spanish by the mayordomo. So from there, then what I want to do next is to root this intersection of auditory, visual, and tactile within a rural Andean ritual and ceremonial life. And then after that, within sort of a broader history of change in the Andes. So first, ritual and ceremonial life. I'm going to focus on one particular little detail to show exactly what this might have looked like. I should specify beforehand that these are educated guesses. This is an educated speculation or hypothesis of what these khipus might have meant in the social historical context of the time, based on various ethnographic and historical records of social life on the island. So what I want to draw your attention to now is if you see that little piece of red string that's tied into the middle in the khipu, yeah, right next to the big white potato bit. So if you look at it, it's a 2-ply thread with a final S twist. So it's shiny, it's really shiny, and it's very fine and quite visibly not hand spun. I can't zoom in for you, but so it appears to be made of mercerized cotton, such as is commonly used for modern sewing threads and embroidery threads. The mercerization sort of makes the chemical process to make the cotton quite shiny, among other things. So my hypothesis is that this piece of thread might signify an allusion to Santiago Apostle, who is Saint James the Greater. He's one of the island's patron saints. Devotion to Santiago is especially prevalent throughout the Bolivian Altiplano. And on the island of the Sun, devotion to Santiago stems from colonial times. The Augustinian friar and chronicler Ramos Gavilan mentions a chapel dedicated to Santiago, which was erected on top of the sacred rock Titicaca. So during the 19th century, scholars sometimes referred to the island of the Sun as Santiago de Titicaca, after the aforementioned chapel. Even today, the plateau on which the sacred rock stands is called Santiago Pampa, and Pampa means sort of a rock or a high plateau. Color is also known to be important for some aspects of khipu semiosis. In the Andes, red has generally been associated with blood, which might mean war, but can also mean fertility. So it can reference menstrual blood, for instance. Throughout the Andes, Santiago is associated often with the figure of Quiapa, who is the god of lightning and the bringer of rain, but also hail. So he has to be appeased if crops are not to be destroyed, or if livestock and people are not to be struck down by lightning. And because this is a really high rural area, lightning storms are extremely dangerous. None of the houses most of the houses do not have the grounding. That means that they can strike your house and you will be safe. And the association between Santiago and Yapa is longstanding. So it stems from pre-invasion Spanish Catholic associations between Santiago and thunder, which Spanish missionaries encouraged in order to replace the veneration of Yapa with the veneration of Santiago. So black, white, yellow, and red are colors which have sometimes been associated with the veneration of lightning. So for instance, in the Vilcanota Valley in Cusco in Peru, offerings to Yapa after lightning strike include red and white kernels of corn. More specifically, however, there is also precedent for colored threads being used as a marker or a sign or chimpu in the Aymara in khipus regarding pastoral and agricultural fertility. Contemporary Hahachakans would insert colored threads for chimpu into the knots of the ritual khipus, so as, quote, to not lose the llamas and alpacas of the region, implying that other threads, like the animals they noted, were constrained by the knots. So this is a technique which is explicitly associated by them with having been passed down from the Incas. From Taquile, which is an island very close to the island of the Sun, another anthropologist has recorded a khipu made by Nibis UKRI, where one chord marks various important festivals of the annual calendar with different colored tassels. The festival for Santiago, which the maker of the quipu specifically noted was important for giving thanks for the harvest, is represented by a red and white tassel. So, and then the sort of rooting then in sort of an agricultural life also fits into what we know ethnographically of ritual and agricultural life on the island of the sun. So first, the loop into which the thread is tied holds a piece of tuta, like we said previously. It's a type of white chunyu or freeze-dried potato. At the turn of the century, shortly sort of about 40 years before this quipu was made, we know that we have records from anthropologist scholars at the time who had visited the island saying that chunyu was commonly made on the island of the sun, with white chunyu undergoing a different process than black chunyu. So there's white in the middle and then black towards the top. So let me see. So black chunyu is specifically made from poor quality potatoes, whereas white chunyu is made from especially selected potatoes and are more highly valued, especially when the resulting chunyu is large, perfectly white, and without cracks. So you can see from this specimen held in this quipu that it's, even after 70 years, it's still white, it's still whole, and it still doesn't have cracks in it, which is indicative of the high quality of chunyu which is recorded by this quipu and which would have befitted something which was meant to be associated with a figure as important as St. James the Greater. And second, contemporary armor on the island of the sun commonly used. There are records of from the 20th century of them using quipus to keep their accounts with the hacienda. And chunyu, potatoes, and broad beans were common harvests on the island, along with some various other crops. So as a result, these quipus were also likely originally made and used to not just record sales and harvest, but specifically made and used to record their accounts with the haciendas. The Aymara on the islands were expected to grow crops for the hacienda owners, as well as to sell produce on behalf of the hacienda in the nearest town, thus accounting for the keepers recording both produce grown and sold. And oral histories on the island recall that in the pre-land reform years, the crops for the hacienda were grown communally according to a crop rotation system called Ainuja, meaning that these quipu almost probably specifically recount produce from the Ainuja fields. So this is a system of crop rotation where every year one Ainuja is selected as the field of the year to first produce potatoes, the second year oca, the third year barley. Then the field lies fallow for 5 years while sheep graze on it, fertilizing it for another cycle. This system is still in use from modern ethnographic accounts. In Chaya, which is the community on the other side of the island, there are today 7 fields which are rotated between producing potatoes, oca, broad beans, and barley. And members of the community are selected every year to be hamanis. So those are responsible for the ainujas and harvest from them. And so these hamanis then, this hamani position is, they don't only care for the fields when it looks like. So, for instance, the hamanis, if it looks like it might rain, the hamanis take frogs to the hilltops so that their song calls down the rain. When it looks like hail, they light fireworks to chase the storm away. But they're also responsible for making other ritual offerings. And so one of the most important of them is sponsoring the Feast of Santiago. In modern-day Chaya, on Santiago's feast day, the hamanis are prominent in the procession after the Mass in his honor on his day, following behind as a litter with a large image of him, portrayed with his beard, cape, and sword, mounted on a white horse. That they're required to do so is due to the intimate relationship between agriculture and the Feast of Santiago, which manifests through the ritual responsibilities of the hamanis, who act as mediators for the powers of the landscape, who they call upon in order to secure the fertility of the crops and evade the risk of hail. So in the identification between Santiago and lightning remains today. So in 2013, the sponsor for Santiago explained that he decided to undertake the responsibility because he had been struck by lightning 2 years prior, for instance. So as a result, so these quipus then likely record an Ainuja crop harvest, as a system which is closely associated with the ritual life associated with Santiago. And so it's it's possible that this is also something which referred to Santiago and his crucial position in the sort of agriculture and ritual cycle, even as it is recording a sort of wider harvest. And second, I mean, this is another aspect I want to bring up here is within the broader political history of the Andes. And I think it's especially apt here because through the hacienda, there is a direct link with the colonial Inca past. So the son of the on Sempere's note, he mentions Senora Pandowarachi. So, or Senor de Pere, way Spanish surname works, but I was skipping about. But Yumani had been inherited by the owner of the Alberto Perrin, who was a friend of Sempere, who donated the quipu to the Smithsonian. Yumani had been inherited by Alberto Perrin by his mother, whose maiden name had been Leonor Pando Huarachi. Her parents had been, in turn, the former president of Bolivia, Jose Manuel Pando, and Carmen Huarachi Sinchi Roca. Carmen Huarachi, and Huarachi being the surname is what gives it, had been a descendant of the famed Huarachi caciques or native lords of Jesus de Machaca. So they had been one of the richest and most powerful noble families of that region during the colonial period. They managed to retain a lot of their power and privilege, such as their property, even during periods when the influence of the Inca nobility had generally been in decline. And this branch of the Huarachi family were descendants of a Juan Colque Huarachi, the lord of the Quiaques, whose life spanned first the Spanish invasion and the decades that followed it. He himself had been much favored by the Spanish. His father had been closely allied to and involved with the Inca ruling elite. He'd been a hereditary lord. He had served on important war councils, submitted Pizarro alongside the Inca. And what we have from him is that in the 1570s, Juan Colque Huarachi submitted a series of proofs of services and merit to the Spanish, to Spain, where he laid out his genealogy. He describes his ancestors. He lays back claim to a genealogy going back 3 generations. He asserts, various important things. He asserts, so these are subjective documents, which are designed to put their subjects in the best possible light. So his probanzas thus showed off his illustrious ancestors, framed in ways that were acceptable and comprehensive to Spanish courts. But they still display his influence and prominence. And in particular, one of the things he talks about in those probanzas is a gift of 3 shirts, of silver, of gold, and of precious stones under the brain of one of the Incas. So you can see that he is claiming a particular kind of influence, which is not only Spanish, but also Indian ways of knowing, such as through textiles, to establish his authority. So because not only did he employ the people who made those particular kinds of cloths for him, but his probanzas also may have been based off of then existing quipus. And he might have held some of these quipus himself, because Juan Colque Huarachi's home in Potosí in southern Bolivia was renowned at the time for housing a substantial and significant archive of manuscripts and quipus. This quipu archive was so established that the Jesuit chronicler Blas Barrera cites them in his Relación, in one of his accounts, as evidence for his accounts of pre-Columbian history. So Barrera credits Juan Colque Huarachi with an extensive knowledge of history, which he attributes to his mastery of quipus and his quipu archives. And among that archive would undoubtedly have been herding and produce quipus of the same genre as these quipus from the 1940s. So, and now this is a set of quipus from his descendants' estate. So that we can make such a direct historical link between a set of modern ethnographic quipus and a known quipu master, it reinforces the sort of living link between modern and ancient quipus. But it's not necessarily a line of like resistance or sort of timeless continuity. Instead, it's, if anything, perhaps more indicative of an enduring nature of institutional power, that this line has been traced by Andean elite who are largely loyal to the Spanish, even as it points to the practices and technologies and the forms of writing which are carried along in its wake. So the majority of ethnographic quipus have come from haciendas, which are a direct descendant of that sort of Inca and then Spanish colonial institutional system. One anthropologist has speculated that quipus as a technology survived the Spanish invasion precisely because they transferred really well between Inca and Spanish bureaucracies. Because quipus were tools of the Inca administration, recording histories, recording tribute. Modern quipus continue to be bureaucratic in nature, but they were not linked to the state, but rather to another hierarchical institution, the hacienda. And she's noted that quipu youth in the central and southern Andes, and this is something actually that people told me during fieldwork as well, has been gradually disappearing since the mid-century, i.e. when the agrarian reforms in Peru and Bolivia abolished hacienda. So I knew someone during fieldwork when I was asking about quipus, he said, oh yeah, my parents, my grandparents used to do them, but the moment the hacienda system fell, they stopped using them because they were horrible memories of the force of the labor they had to do. And this is the point at which, so one of my concerns here with laying all of this out is to sort of use writing systems, chord writing systems like this as a window into how sort of colonialism, colonial history, all that change, both happens and doesn't happen. So some things are consistent, some things do transfer, but a lot of things also have changed a lot. There's been both continuity and discontinuity. So, and I think this is at the point where there's the potential for a sort of hook for a comparative angle across the Pacific. Given how quipus are grounded in these continuity and Indian epistemologies, but also in a sort of colonial and post-colonial context. So how do these intersections, as seen within a knotted chord writing system, change in reaction to colonization, not as a single event, but as repeated overlapping waves of it? So the Incas in the worldwide conquest of the Andes are presumed to have spread quechua along with it. They conquered like a lot of territory in not like less than 200 years. And so when Pizarro came in, people still remembered that, right? The colonial invasion was the colonial impact of the Incas very recent. And so, sorry, realizing I'm running out of time. And so it's on, so, okay. So then assuming very, very broadly that colonial powers that ran, for instance, haciendas, prioritize, for instance, visual knowledge across above all else, how does that change how quipus are made in these circumstances? And that's what I mean by sort of looking at what endures and what changes. So for instance, I would need a lot more data, which is not currently available, but one speculation might be that quipus became more visual or more iconic in how they convey information because of the necessities of having a system which is sort of compatible with an institutional system which values visual knowledge above sort of the auditory or the sensory. And it's at this kind of level which I'm interested in a sort of very broad comparative angle. So, for instance, comparing these records to, knotted records in Taiwan, which is an island which has seen wave after wave of colonization, right? From the Spanish, the Dutch, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Chinese again. And there's all these overlapping ones. It's a country which scholars have argued is basically both simultaneously colonial and post-colonial in its history. And so this is a quipu which is from the Chime community among the Amis in eastern Taiwan. So this is from Facebook. There's another one which I can tell you about, but this is on Facebook, so it's private. And this is a family tree. So the caption to this one said, do the Amis have a family tree? Of course they do, in the Chime. So I'm reading you the caption. The Amis have no written language, but in the Chime tribe, the elders used knotted strings to record family trees a long time ago. The family tree in the photo show a couple who had 3 children and each got married and had children and so forth. So you can see that from the beginning and it branches down. And they point out particularly that the branch in the upper left corner later gave birth to 8 children. This family tree is a knot tied by Ado of the Chime tribe. The material is a rami rope. So rami is a kind of nettle fiber that she twisted herself. This family tree is the family tree of the ancestors of Grandpa Osen. So obviously there are various differences with the Andes. This is a genealogy. It's not a genealogy. This material is different. But it's also when I was asking about these, one of the things that people said to me, they were like, oh yeah, people have them as mnemonic devices, but they learn them from their mothers. And I was like, but that doesn't make, if it's a system that is passed on from mother to daughter to mother to daughter, that implies pretty strongly, at least to me, that this is not purely a personal mnemonic system, but it is actually a mnemonic device, but it is in fact a systematic sort of way of recording information that is in fact passed on from person to person. And it's also the case here where a lot of the better accounts, so you have also other accounts of khipus, not khipus, knotted records like this being used for Japanese colonial bureaucracies, Japanese colonial administration, being used as records of debts among police under the Japanese colonial system would accept these strings as these records as proof in court context. And so this is one of the things where my specialization is largely in the Andes, and I don't know either Taiwan or Japan well enough to speculate or to guess in the same way I might about the Andes. But in the same way, I think it's a template for thinking with in terms of those structural similarities, but also differences. So for instance, in Okinawa, which is just to the east of Taiwan, you have similar what are called warazan records made from rami that resemble these, but they also changed in response to the Japanese, sort of increasing Japanese influence in Okinawa, changing to more visual, sort of more iconic ways of conveying information before sort of eventually dying out in favor of like syllabic or logosyllabic writing.